you can't just answer it's stuck and it's going to be stuck forever and we're just going to leave it forever. You've got to come up with a strategy to deal with that. And that strategy needs to be in GeoTracker. So we're here to share some ideas of how you can develop that strategy. So I have with me several colleagues. Let me start over here and do just quick introductions. Deirdre Nuri, who works with me up in San Francisco and has a lot of expertise in brownfields, and she's also going to talk a little bit about other types of money available. And Linda R. Kellyan, who's a contractor working for us and the state, and she's based out of EPA's LA field office and has been really helping us focus on sites in Southern California. And pronounce it Katya Smirnova, who's with a company called Industrial Economics. And this company's been doing RP search work and ability to pay work and financial analysis work for EPA for years, and they're very much experts. And she came all the way out from the East Coast, from the Boston area, to come and talk. But she may end up spending the weekend in Southern California because of the blizzard hitting the East Coast right now. So it's too bad we don't have a nice sunny day in Southern California. So, and then Grant Miner from Fullerton Fire Department. Sorry about that. He's going to talk about some of his strategies he's used on difficult stuck cases. And Anthony Martinez up in front here from Orange County Health, the LOP, talking about some stuck cases that he's worked on. So this picture here is, we heard this term a lot when we did some reviews of cases last couple of years. It's assigned dead end. We actually heard people have, they had categories of cases and they called them dead end cases because they were too difficult to move forward on, so they were just dead end. And we thought this one was pretty funny because this was one of those cases and it actually had a sign on the site that said dead end. We like to use the term stuck cases. These are ones that kind of have hit that roadblock for some reason, and a lot of these have hit that roadblock not for technical reasons but for other reasons. And we kind of define the stuck cases as cases that really are not making progress towards cleanup completion and case closure, where they're just sitting there and they're not in a state of managed natural attenuation. They're just not making progress. So we're here to talk about tools and techniques, including funding sources, research tools, and strategies, and explore strategies to move forward with limited resources. I mean, that's one of the big challenges we have in this program compared to other environmental programs. Being at EPA, we have the Superfund program, and they have, one case may have multiple attorneys assigned to it. Where in the tank program, we've got one attorney for, well, actually, we've got a fraction of attorney for all tank program work within my regional office. So we're really limited in terms of the types of resources we have. So we've got to come up with strategies that are very efficient in order to move forward on cases. We can't get bogged down and do the same level of research that you would do on a big case like a Superfund case or a large RCRA TSD facility. We know there are a lot of stuck cases in California. If people here are from LOPs or regional boards, they probably have heard from my staff a couple years back where we were looking at the older cases that were not in the cleanup fund. We're doing an analysis of those to try to figure out what was slowing those cases down, what were the barriers to closure, and in that process we identified a number of cases that were essentially, we call them stuck. They were not moving forward. There have been the impediments to closure evaluations in GeoTracker, brownfield inventories, recently working with Laura Fisher to get lists of abandoned UST sites, and we were actually surprised. The list has now grown to almost 250 sites in the state, of sites where they're not cleanup sites yet, because there's no confirmed release. They're not operating USTs, so not actively permitted facilities. They're kind of in between, where somebody's walked away from the site, it's not clear if they've had a leak or not, and they're just sitting there and they're not on any list. And that's a problem for somebody, especially somebody who may come out and buy that site, not really realizing what they're buying. We've seen many situations where that's happened. Again, I mentioned the I-710 geographic pilot. The low threat closure review is now also going to be continuing to identify stuck cases and, well, in the abandoned tank inventory. So the non-cuff study was really, purpose of that was to understand barriers to closure and explore issues issues related to these non-funded sites, because these are not in the cleanup fund, and I believe the cleanup fund right now is only about a third of the open cases in the state. So what's happening with the other cases? Where's the money coming from? How are they getting handled? And a lot of them aren't moving because they don't have money. So in that process, we did review over 1,000 cases, and initially 150 closed. And I believe actually after that point, even more have closed from that group that we looked at of 1,000 cases. So this I-710 pilot, we focused on basically pulling together the inventory in this geographic area. There were actually, I believe, was it 600 or so cases total? Closer to 700 open lust cases in that area when we started looking at this. So just, to give you a sense of how that relates to my other states, that's almost as many as the whole state of Arizona. So, when we were actually pretty surprised. But we ended up focusing on those sites, doing some file reviews, a lot of research. A lot of cases have gotten closed because of that work. We did field work at a number of sites, removed abandoned USTs at several of the sites. We did some inspection work with some federal contractors, and we learned quite a bit. We learned that some of the things you could do that were efficient, and we also learned how hard certain things were. So some of the things we did learn, common causes of stuck sites, things like no funding or the responsible party unwilling to spend. I think there are two types of RPs. There's the global multinationals that seem like they have plenty of money, and then the ones that don't have any money. And there's usually nobody in between. I've had a lot of RPs come to me and claim they don't have the money, and you do a little bit of research and you realize they have plenty of money. I remember one time the guy telling me he has no money, broke, can't spend anything, goes out to the parking lot to a $100,000 Porsche. So I think he's got some money, he just doesn't want to spend it on the tank cases. A lot of government agencies also, they have cases and they have a lack of funding. I mean, it's tough because everybody's budgets are imploding and they're looking at priorities, and we're seeing a lot of government cases. Cases where the RPs cannot be located. That happens quite often. People disappear, they move out of the country, they move somewhere else. They have very common names, so we're going to hear a little bit about how to locate RPs. Access issues. I'm sure that's something that a lot of people have heard about. We've seen issues where actually it is a technical problem. It's technically impracticable to get the site cleaned up. You could have a lot of NAPL and it can be really deep, and it's just, you'd be spending millions of dollars to try to clean up the site. I'm sure people have seen sites like that. And then there are those situations where the site is essentially low risk and the agencies have too many cases, so the case is backburnered. And some common barriers we saw to making progress: limited legal support, limited access and training for research tools, limited guidance, inability or difficulty accessing public funds, and sites that require a large level of effort. So, it's so much work, we're not going to even go there. But, the bottom line that we did learn is tools are available to move these stuck sites if you want, but prying them loose and getting them going is challenging. It's a lot of effort. So, like I mentioned before, we've got some other experts here to share their thoughts and ideas and help you all develop your strategies for moving forward with sites. So next up is Katja and she's going to talk about tools for finding RPs and assessing ability to pay.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone for coming. So my name is Katya. I'm with Industrial Economics, and we work with Sullivan and ultimately with EPA, helping them locate RPs and also conducting ability to pay analysis on the RPs. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be talking about these two processes, which are somewhat different because we use different methods and different approaches to do those processes. And I'll also be doing a little bit of demonstration of various online tools that are available. So if folks are interested and you're all the way back there, you will not be able to see it. Just saying. So the first process that I'll talk about is the RP search and identification. And what happens there is that usually Linda from Sullivan sends us the initial research that they've done on the site at a minimum that contains the site address, which is a big deal. And it also usually contains some information on the history of site and perhaps some of the names of the people or the companies associated with the site. And then our charge is to research the owners of the site, both past and current, the business entities that operate at the site, and the individuals who may be linked to the owners or to the businesses. And in the end, what we basically create is a big web that shows different connections between different people and businesses. And with that, we provide the tools to the EPA to identify who may be responsible for the contamination and who may be able to contribute to the site assessment cost. So there are two ways to try to find an RP and to research the site. And that is either using public data or private data. And the public data sources are pretty straightforward. Everybody has access to those. It's things like the county assessor's office information, which is actually usually very helpful because you would have data on deeds and deed trusts, and you might find out who currently owns the site or who owned the site in the past, except in the case of the I-710 project, all of these sites are in LA County, and LA County's property records are not available online. So, and we are in Boston. So we use different data sources to get to that, but if you are in the area, you are definitely able to just go over to the actual physical office, and they will do all the work for going through the documents and finding the papers that you need for you. But definitely helps if things are online. And then there are other things that we use, like Corporation Wiki, which is similar to Wikipedia, and it kind of shows you different businesses and people, and it shows the connections that they may have based on the data that they are reviewing. LinkedIn actually is surprisingly helpful because if you find a person and that person has a page on LinkedIn, you may be able to find the businesses that that person is associated with, and that helps you further develop your web. This is just an example of the screenshot from the Office of the Assessor for one of the sites that we're looking at. And you can see here that there is an assessor's ID, there is an actual site address, and again, this is very helpful because oftentimes what happens is the way that the UST site is being referred to by everyone is not its actual address, and the address may be a couple of digits off, and then if you start searching the wrong address, you come up with all the wrong information. So the first thing to know is the actual site address, and with that, the parcel ID helps, and so the assessor's information is very important. The second batch of data sources that we use is the private data, and depending who you're with, you may or may not have access to those data sources. Usually, definitely private companies can buy all this. I know that with EPA, for example, you guys have LexisNexis access, but it may be restricted to certain cases or to certain categories of employees. Property Shark anybody can get to. You just have to pay. Same with Dun & Bradstreet. So what we do with these different data sources is Property Shark is the one that we use because we cannot get the LA County records for property ownership online. They actually apparently went in and digitized all of those records, and now they sell them. So if the LA County could digitize their own records, that would save someone some money. LexisNexis is obviously probably the most famous one and also the most useful. We use it for comprehensive address reports, and I'll be showing that in a bit. Basically, you enter the address, and it gives you out information on all the businesses and people that may be associated with this address. Comprehensive business report is a report on a business. It's somewhat similar to Dun & Bradstreet. It would give you information about the line of business that they're in, how long they have existed. If they have information on owners or officers, they will give you that. It may give you information on the status of this business, whether it's active or not. And usually, by far, the most useful is the National Comprehensive Report. And I'll be showing you one on myself in a little bit. And that's a report that shows information about a specific individual, any relatives, employment, date of birth, social security number. I will not be showing you my social security number. Things like that, you'll see. Intellius is a similar database. It's sort of newer than LexisNexis. We just use it to cross-check the information that we pull from LexisNexis. Dun & Bradstreet is a data source that used to be very popular, but it has its own limitations. It's a data source that gives you information about businesses. But the problem with that is that Dun & Bradstreet sends out surveys to companies. So if it sends a survey to industrial economics, where I work, and industrial economics feels so inclined as to fill out that survey and say that we have revenues of $500 million, that's what Dun & Bradstreet will report, regardless of whether we actually have that kind of revenues or not. And so it's self-reported, and it only relies on those companies that basically decided to respond to a survey. So it's not particularly reliable. So I'm going to get out of the presentation for a second and show you first just the way that the LexisNexis page looks. This is the data pool for the individuals. So you have the last name, the first name. Ideally, if you're looking for an RP, if you have at least some information along those lines, that's tremendously helpful. So last name, first name. Social security, obviously, is the best one. If you have that, it will find for you exactly the person that you're looking for. Address, or at least the city, helps. Date of birth definitely helps. But basically, you can enter information in any one of these fields, and it will pull up anything that matches that field. So if you just fill out one field, it will get you something if it can find something. So I'm not going to be showing it. But for example, if you enter just my name in here, Smirnova Katya, and put the city as Boston, it actually produces no results. And that is very indicative of the problems that we run into. And that is that people go by names that are different than their legal names. Katya is not my legal name, and none of my legal documents use Katya as my name. So when NCR, National Comprehensive Reports, looks for information on Katya Smirnova, it finds nothing. And then if you have that kind of a situation, then you need to think how to try to overcome that. So my actual name is Ekaterina Smirnova, and I'll show you what pops up if I do that. And I live in Somerville, Mass. And hopefully internet is fast enough. Yeah, so what comes up is a number of records here. My name in Russian actually is sort of an equivalent to Chris Smith or something like that. So because I limited it to Somerville, there is me and there is one other Ekaterina Smirnova, of whom I knew because once somebody confused me with her in a hospital in Boston. Anyway, so this information pops up that shows date of birth, address, things like that. And if it looks like someone that you're interested in, then you choose to pull up the report. And you can pull National Comprehensive Report or National Comprehensive Report plus Associates, which will show all the relatives and other related people that may potentially be useful to you. So I'll show you a National Comprehensive Report on myself. And again, this will highlight some of the issues that we run into. So it has my name. It has a middle initial, which I never use, so I don't know where they got it from. It then has 4 addresses, and while those addresses are correct, and I lived at all 4 of those, the dates are wrong. For example, for this 3rd address, 409 Mass Ave, it says that it's an April 2009 address. I lived there for a year in 2006. I haven't lived there since then. So if you're looking for an RP and it's giving you an address where that person is living now, it may not actually be the address where the person is living. In addition, this particular address summary doesn't have at least 3 other addresses where I've lived in the past, and I've lived there for a longer period of time, actually. I have no bankruptcies yet. People at work, interestingly, I've been with industrial economics for 6 years. It doesn't think I'm there. It doesn't have my driver's license, even though I have one. It doesn't know that I'm married. It doesn't know that I have a kid. So it's useful, but it's limited. The most useful information that it has, and I'm not going to go too much into that, but anything that's associated with property records, so usually it's cars, real estate, houses, land, is what gets pulled up in here because they brush through all the property records in all the counties and states and cities in the US, and they pull up anything that's associated with this name and this social security number. And from that, you can start developing your web of connections and trying to get to the site that you're interested in. Another good thing about LexisNexis is that instead of entering my last name and my first name, I could enter just the address, and for that, you could, for example, enter the address of the UST site that you're looking at. And that will pull up anything that it can find that is associated with that address. So I did here a pull on our office address, which is 2067 Mass Ave in Cambridge. And it pulls up a long list of companies and one individual. And actually, this person is, I think, the building owner. And this long list of companies, it's actually a pretty small building, and half of these companies don't sound familiar to me. They may have been there 10 years ago. So again, information is there, but it's not 100% precise, and it may be outdated. I guess our address is not very interesting because it doesn't produce much more than this. But sometimes, excuse me, these records can be much longer. And actually, the same thing can be said about NCRs. My history is not very long and not very interesting, but there can be people, and it seems that a lot of these potentially responsible parties are that kind of people who buy and sell real estate all the time, and they are involved in a lot of different businesses that they start and they stop, and they start on a new business and so on. So their NCRs can be 50 pages long or dozens of pages long, and then it's, again, an exercise of going through all of it and trying to connect the dots and build a comprehensive picture. Going back to our presentation here. So those were the public sources of data. Our next slide is basically what we do with it is we build up that web, and then we try to connect the dots and combine and link information and form a comprehensive picture as best we can. And what we produce for Sullivan and for EPA is a brief summary of findings. So that's a couple of pages of text that summarizes what we found. And then we developed this template that we fill out for any business or individual that we found that's connected to the site in question. And we also produce a usually pretty large PDF file that contains all the backup documentation to our analysis. And normally, depending on the complexity of the site, but it takes us about 15 to 20 hours to do that. And usually it's a budget of about $1,500. This is an example of that standard template. So on the left-hand side are the standard fields. So different data sources that we reviewed, and then we'll check off whether we found any information in those data sources. And then on the right here, there would usually be some text describing what we found and providing summary of data. The issues, like I said, there are many issues with this kind of process. Property records may not be available online. Site histories can be very long and complex, and there can be multiple site owners. People have gone through bankruptcies. People pass away. They create trusts. Those trusts own the sites. It's really difficult to track all of this down and try and connect it. Big problem is people with really common names like Chris Smith, or names that can be spelled in multiple ways. It seems that a lot of the cases that we get have to do with immigrants, so their names may not be originally spelled in Latin alphabet, and so they can be transliterated into English in a million different ways. Or recently I had a case, the Chinese gentleman's name was Chur, but he went by Chuck in the US, and we just spent hours and hours until we figured that out, and we connected that Chuck and Chur are actually the same person. So trying to figure all of that out can take some time and adds to the complexity of the process. The next part that we do is the ability to pay analysis, and those differ depending on what kind of entity you're looking at, and that is either a business or an individual or other types of entities like a nonprofit church or something like that. And so the financial information inputs will vary based on the type of entity that you're reviewing. And what we do is, as a first cut, we use US EPA enforcement models, which we developed for them many, many years ago, and that we still maintain and update. And we use those results as a first cut, but the results should always be treated with care, because it's just the software that takes your numbers and generates something. So it's like one of my clients used to say, junk in, junk out. So you always have to have a person looking over the results and figuring out whether it actually makes sense. For business entities, usually at the point of an ability to pay analysis, we would have an RP or several RPs. And in the perfect world, you can request some sort of financial information from them, such as tax returns. We again do online research if we haven't done the RP search part of it before. We see what's out there about this business. Sometimes newspaper articles can be very helpful, because they will tell you, they will have a director of the company saying that, oh, we just bought all this equipment and we're planning to expand and our future is so rosy. And then 3 days after giving that interview to the newspaper, they would come to the EPA and say that they have no money. And so that kind of information can be helpful in doing an ability to pay analysis. And like I said, we use the ABLE model. And what it does is it creates a financial profile of the company, and then it generates projected cash flow for the company for the next 5 years. And based on that, it gives you a result as to whether it thinks the company can afford to pay for the site. And this is just an example of a screenshot from ABLE. What it has here is a probabilistic distribution based on the amount of payment. And so for this specific company, there is a 100% chance that they can pay $0. And then the probability goes down as the amount goes up. The second approach we do is for the individuals. It's obviously different. Again, gather the tax returns, do the research. And for individuals, we mostly look at their income, their expenses, their assets, and their liabilities. And again, use the IndyPay model and input all the tax return data in. And what IndyPay does is it looks at your ability to pay from two different standpoints. It looks at your expected cash flow and whether you generate cash above your expenses, so whether your income is greater than your expenses. And it also sort of like when you get a mortgage, it looks at whether you can afford any additional debt. And then based on that, it gives you a determination as to whether a person can afford a contribution from his or her cash flow and also through additional debt financing. And again, with the ability to pay analysis, it's less standardized because it's a different company every time or a different individual, and everyone's situations are different. We produce a 2 to 3 page memorandum with a summary of model runs. And there are some examples over here that Linda has that she'll, I guess, pass down if you'd like to take a look or take them with you. At the back, those usually have a summary of model runs, and then there's usually a PDF, again, with backup documentation. These analyses usually take us about 50 to 70 hours, and the budget is around $5,000. And again, there are many issues with ability to pay analyses. The respondents may be unwilling or unable to produce financial documentation, and without that, it's really difficult for us to make any determination. What we've done in the past where people were really unwilling to produce anything is, again, conduct online search and try to identify whether they have any assets, and then based on that, make a very limited and qualified determination about their ability to pay. Lots of these RPs are small businesses, and they're not required to generate extensive financial reporting, so it may be difficult to get from them financial data, and sometimes it may be even difficult to explain what exactly we need. Also, lots of the RPs seem to be elderly, and with elderly individuals, what we've found a lot is that they either produce incomplete information, and they actually tend to understate their expenses. I don't know whether it's just from not understanding why they're doing it, or they feel that they should show that they're spending less than they actually are. But we always, when we get retirees' financial data, we always try to review it critically first, just to make sure that we're not making the person live in poverty for the rest of his or her life. And with elderly individuals, it's also a problem because you never know what their life expectancy may be. We've done financial analysis of nonprofits. We've done a church for Sullivan recently. It's a completely different beast, and that has no model that you can plug data into. By the way, the models are all public, and you can download them from EPA's website, and they're pretty easy to use if you have the data. So for a church, we did a analysis that was totally outside of the models, and that's actually one of the examples that Linda passed. And then again, communication barriers. People don't exactly understand what we need from them. They may not understand why we need it. They may not speak the same language, or English may not be their first language. So Linda will talk more about that in her case study examples, but that's the issues that we face. And we already had that slide. Oops, sorry. Yep, and that's it for me, and up next is Deirdre.
Thanks, Katya. That was really quite interesting. I learned a lot from that. Do I just hit the space bar if I want to advance a slide?
Probably down arrow.
Oh, down arrow? Okay.
On the right-hand side.
Okay. So I'm going to talk quickly about funding issues. Funding is obviously a primary reason why stuck sites can't move forward. So I'm going to quickly highlight some options that have been highlighted before in this conference, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But I'm giving four potential sources of funding that can help move a stuck site. The first we call TBA funds. That means Targeted Brownfield Assessment, and that's a federal option for funding. A TBA funding, that's not a grant per se. It's actually a service that's provided through EPA. EPA will use its contract and direct that contractor to complete a phase 1 and or phase 2 for the applicant. the qualifications are that you can't have a viable RP. The site has to be designated for a future use. Potential redevelopment has to be a factor here. And it's a state or local government that has to make that request. A second source of federal funding would be, let's see, I'm not keeping up with my, here's targeted brownfields assessment. A second source of federal funding would be the Federal Lust Trust Fund. And that can be used when a viable owner-operator can't be found immediately within 90 days, or cleanup requires a prompt action, or the costs will exceed financial assurance coverage requirements, or the owner-operator is recalcitrant. There does not need to be a confirmed release here, unlike some of these other funding pots that we're talking about. I'm going to move on to two sources of state funding, the EAR account and the OSCA account. I have flyers that Judy Reed gave me that I have in the back that will explain both of those state programs for those who need that information. But the EAR account, a local agency has to apply for that. And the site requirements are, again, that it's emergency, that there's no RP that can be found, or we've got recalcitrant owners. There needs to be a confirmed release here, unlike the Federal Lust Trust Fund. In this case, the state will place a lien on the property. So there's a disincentive for owners to go this route because it means that there's this kind of cost recovery enforcement angle to it. Finally, just wanted to quickly highlight the state's orphan cleanup fund. The applicant here can be a public agency, a prospective buyer, or a property owner. This makes this option pretty unique. The applicant must not have contributed or caused or contributed to the release. It can't be eligible for the general UST cleanup fund, and it must qualify as a brownfield under the state's definition of a brownfield, meaning it has to be located in an urban area of 50,000 people or above. And the site needs to have been vacant for a period of not less than 12 months prior to the date of the application. So again, check out those flyers in the back if you'd like more information about these funding sources. Linda's going to get into the sites in our 710 project where we actually experimented with these funding sources with some success in moving some stuck sites forward. So I would like to have Grant Miner come up now. He's with the Fullerton Fire Department, and he's going to be talking about the local enforcement strategies to move stuck sites.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys all hanging out here for the last session. I'm going to try and be brief, and I know that everybody's jurisdiction is different and all your problem sites are going to be different, but hopefully from what I'm going to go over, you can maybe get some ideas for your own enforcement strategies. Back a couple of years ago when I took over tanks in Fullerton, we had 3 sites with a total of 6 tanks that had been in improper closure a long time. Some we had active RPs on site, none of the tanks were operating. Some we didn't. So I won't go into the details because we've already discussed finding RPs, but once I got a look at these sites, the first thing that I thought was important to do was prioritize them, because like most of your agencies, I'm sure, we have very limited resources. So there was no way I was going to be able to go after all 3 sites at once. So in prioritizing them, you might look at the age, how long has the tank been, abandoned or improperly closed. The status, was there evidence of a release? Were there massive failures in testing? Why did the tank operator walk away from it? Also, who was the operator? Who's your current RP? So for myself, what I looked at was I prioritized them based on which one I thought would be the easiest to close, and then went to the next harder and next harder. Turns out I wasn't exactly right in my assessment, but it all turned out okay in the end. Within 2 years, we had all the tanks out of the ground, and we'd done our site assessments. The first thing to do is to go back, if you've got improperly closed tanks, go back and look at the file. Even if you were the inspector of record, for myself, there were prior inspectors. So I don't know about your file systems, but in ours, this was a more difficult chore than I thought it was going to be. I had to go through different files in different locations and kind of piece together what had happened. And as I went through, I created a chronology of the big events. When were they issued a notice of violation? Even if it wasn't for improper closure, were they noticed for failing to do 989 testing or a monitor shirt? Did the owner operator switch at some point? Did they ask for temporary closure? That's what I mean by major events, things that are germane to the case at hand. And this chronology is going to be very important whether when you meet with your RP. It's also going to be important if you start looking at formal enforcement options, because you want to be able to give somebody 1 8.5 11 page that explains what happened here and why this tank is improperly closed and why it needs to come out of the ground. So you create a chronology, and as part of that, I should say based on that, then come up with a list of violations and include a time frame. And what I mean by this is you know that you have got failure to properly close the tank, if this is the case. But you may also have a lot more additional violations, because just because an operator stops pumping gas or because he walks away from that property doesn't mean his obligation to follow the regulations in Title 23 and in 6.7 of the Health and Safety Code stop. So as you go through your chronology and you identify, hey, he stopped doing his monitor certifications back here in 2005. Oh, and look at this. His last designated operator inspection was in 2008. Keep track of that, because that's going to come into play both in your negotiations with the RP and if you refer it to an outside source for whether we'll discuss formal enforcement a little bit later here. Once you've done that, then it's time to draft a notice of violation. And I do this even before I've contacted the RP. I'm going to take all that file work I did, and it usually took me, better part of a day or better part of a couple of days to do it. I'm going to take that and compress it a little bit into the notice of violation. Now, I've left a redacted notice of violation from one of these sites. I've left a few of those at the back, and you're welcome to help yourself to those on the way out. What I did was include a timeline. So as I'm addressing the responsible party and addressing what the property is, what the tanks in question are, I then include a timeline that outlines all the history of the site up until this point. Then I usually cite, my citation was usually for improper closure. Sometimes I also included operating tanks without a permit, because those are kind of too big, easy to prove, what they call strict liability violations of the Health and Safety Code. And then I made sure to include the penalty language, and off the top of my head I want to say it's section 25299 of the Health and Safety Code. I think most of you are familiar with it. That's the $5,000 per day per tank violation. So that way when the RP is looking at this, he's going to see, here's how we got to this point, here's what you're guilty of, or well, here's what we're asserting that you've done, and here's what the penalty is going to be if you don't comply. Now this step here, and I'm going to move quickly, but this step is probably the most important of all. Out of the 3 sites, I was able to, you identify and contact the RP, I'm getting ahead of myself, and meet with them if you can. If you can't meet with them, at least have a phone conversation. Don't just do an email. Try to have a two-way conversation with them, preferably in person, because it was at this stage that I was able to solve 2 of the 3 cases. Now, mind you, none of these RPs walked out of the room telling me they were going to take the tanks out of the ground. But this laid the groundwork. And after they went back and they talked to their attorneys and so forth, they called me back within a couple of weeks and said, yes, we'd like to discuss our options for removing those underground storage tanks. So this is a little bit of salesmanship. You're going to have to use a little bit of the carrot and a little bit of the stick. So the first thing to do, and everybody has their own styles, I try to be very matter-of-fact. I don't try to go in there, yell at these people, intimidate them, tell them how much trouble they're in. I try to just be very matter-of-fact. I think I started one conversation by saying to called him by his first name, I said, it's way past time you took these tanks out of the ground. Now you're going to get, no matter how nicely you explain the violations and the consequences for those violations, you're going to get pushback. They're never going to say, otherwise these wouldn't be improperly closed. If they wanted to do the right thing, they would have done the right thing, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, whenever it was that they first ran into this problem. So they're going to push back, and folks have talked to you about, looking at the financials and other ways to kind of counter those arguments. But what I try to do is after I hear them out as to why they can't pay or why they don't think it's a problem that their tanks are still in the ground or how they're sure they're clean and there's no fuel in them, I just get back to, well, here's the case. You're in violation of this section of the Health and Safety Code. That's what my notice of violation is going to tell you. And it's going to give you a deadline. And that deadline is going to be whatever deadline it is you've set on the notice of violation. But now, and explain the consequences, but now offer them a way out. And again, this is something you have to come up with as your jurisdiction's policy. My policy was, because I was kind of taking over an older problem, this was the first time they were going to meet with me, that if they agreed to pull the tanks within the time frame we gave them, there would be no additional consequences. We would not seek any further enforcement. They would be stuck paying for removing the tanks and paying for conducting the appropriate testing, and then beyond that, it would depend on the testing results. So this gives them a chance to see their way out. You just spent probably a half hour telling them what trouble they're in. You open that door and point them in that direction. Then set a deadline and stick to it, because these folks have probably worked somebody before, or maybe even worked you if you were have been the inspector on the case, by saying, oh yes, I want to do it, I just need to get the funds together. Can you give me another 60 days? Can you give me another 90 days? You need to set measurable goals and make them stick to it. In my case, what I usually said was, I'll give you 30 days to have approved plans for removal. That's a reasonable thing to do. Probably not necessarily reasonable to expect them to get the tanks out of the ground within 30 days, but 30 days to have approved plans, and then give them an additional 30 days to remove the tanks. Obviously, you're going to come up with your own timeline. Now, one thing that's not up here in the bullet points, but I'm going to get to in a slide, but I would bring up in this meeting, and I think it's important, is offered them the way out. Offered them, that if they remove this tank, there's going to be no further legal consequences, at least from my agency. If it's a waste tank, there could be other issues with other agencies. But I also explained to them that if they choose not to take that option, and this case does get referred, in our case we refer to the Orange County DA's office. If we refer it to the DA, we're going to amend the referral. And what I mean by that is we're not just going to refer you for failure to properly close your tank system. I'm going to go ahead and skip to what I'm talking about. We're going to refer you for operating an underground storage tank without a permit, failure to perform annual test of monitoring system, failure to perform annual test of line leak detectors, failure to test your spill buckets, failure to perform your designated operator inspections, failure to maintain an approved release monitoring plan, failure to have proof of financial responsibility, failure to implement a method of monitoring the tank system, failure to maintain and provide maintenance, monitoring, calibration, and failure to perform required testing of UST secondary containment systems. And each one of those will carry a penalty of $5,000 per day per tank. So once you lay that out for them, they tend to become more cooperative. But you do have to have a backup plan. Because of my 3 sites, I did have one who, after all my work on it, decided that they still weren't going to pull them. So actually they did the opposite. They just kept pushing the deadline back. Oh, I need another 30 days. I need another 60 days. I need another 90 days. So no, we got to our deadline, and I referred it over to the district attorney. And 2 weeks later, they were at my door pulling a permit. So I don't know about your jurisdictions, but in our jurisdiction, the Orange County DA has a very, very proactive environmental crimes section, and they are very proactive about dealing with underground tanks. They understand the rules, and they understand this, the seriousness of it. Other folks may not be so lucky. This is why I emphasize putting together that chronology and putting together that list of violations, because you may not just have to sell the RP that it's a good idea to pull his tanks. You may have to sell your DA that this is important, that this is a crime that actually matters, and that these are very provable, strict liability violations of the Health and Safety Code. And that chronology and that list of violations is going to help you make that sale to the district attorney. Because most of these guys are used to, okay, somebody shot somebody robbed a liquor store. What's the big deal? A guy's got a tank in the ground that shouldn't be there. So that's, again, another reason to do your homework on the file, because if you do have to go to your DA, or your city attorney. A city attorney can often pursue these as civil cases, which still is $5,000 per day per tank. You're going to kind of have to break it down and explain it to them. So there are obviously other enforcement options. If you're a CUPA and you have an administrative enforcement order, that's another way to go. I think, frankly, that's the least of those 3 options I have up there. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover. Any questions? Thanks for your time.
One question.
Sorry?
I have a question. Anybody can, I guess, answer it. But if you have to stay in place that the tanks have been non-operating for years, and you know that there was a release that's been confirmed, there's been, based on YouTube, but it's not going anywhere. And I guess my question is, are the people that owned it back in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s, those people are responsible
I'm going to defer on that.
Well, if you
Well-
can show that the release occurred during the time a specific individual or entity was operating the tank or owned the property, then they can be named as an RP in addition to the landowner. But the landowner can always be named as an RP, no matter if there's proof they caused the release or not.
Well, there's differences between state and federal law.
Yeah, I'm going to state.
Yes, a state. So federal, got to look back, look at what evidence you have. Every situation is different, and it gets complicated the older the cases are. But if you need, when we get to the end, we'll talk a little bit about that. And I think we'll want to maybe hold some of the questions and get into some detailed discussions at the end. But then afterwards, too, you're welcome to talk to us, because if you need help with any sites, we're also here to help, and we're interested in helping people with their stuck sites, developing strategies and helping them kind of use some of the tools that are out there.
I'm going to turn it over now to Anthony Martinez from the Orange County LOP.
Hi. I've got a very short presentation. I've got a total of 2 slides. They're both pictures from Google Earth, and basically I'm just going to talk a little bit about a site that started off very similar to what a situation that Grant had, where we had tanks in the ground, weren't being removed, they weren't permitted anymore. There may have even been some operation without the permit. Our tank surveillance group actually referred the case to the Orange County District Attorney. They filed a case on the owner, and eventually got an injunction and got the tanks pulled. And one of the stipulations in the injunction was that they would pull the tanks, submit a report within 6 months, and comply with all further directives and regulations. Directives from the Orange County Healthcare Agency and other state and local regulations regarding the site. Once the tanks were pulled, we got some samples, we got the results in, it became an LOP case, and so we opened it in our LOP program. That little tiny red square there is the site. It's a very, very small station property. It was a former gas station. It's about 70 feet by 100 feet in size. It had 3 6,000 gallon single wall steel tanks. You can imagine how old those were. And then 1 12,000 single wall steel gas tank. They were all right up against the sidewalk on Beach Boulevard. That's Beach Boulevard there. It's got 8 lanes plus a turn lane in this area. So it's a very busy street, and it's owned by Caltrans. So we had some issues with Caltrans on this site. As you can see, there's really not much space on any of these properties. If they're lucky, like the building next to them to the south, they have parking for about 6 or 7 cars on their property. And then there's another vacant lot that's been turned into a parking lot for another business a little bit farther down. It's a very old part of the county. There's really not a lot of there are no big box stores or anything in this area. It's all just the remnants of the development from the 50s and maybe even going back to the 30s and 40s in some cases. This site, after the tank pull, we opened a cleanup case. We issued a directive, go ahead and do an assessment and give us the results. It took a year. We finally got 3 monitoring wells installed. And lo and behold, one well had about a foot of free product, another well had an inch of product, and the other well had benzene and MTBE concentrations that were through the roof. So then we went into another phase where they agreed to start bailing the product out of the wells. That was good. And then they even gave us a work plan to do more assessment. Then 2-3 months go by. They ask, we tell them, well, you're overdue on your next phase of assessment. Oh, we want to amend that because we've got some access issues in Beach Boulevard. Maybe we want to install a couple wells on the property to the south. and then they even put the alleyway there as an area for their assessment. Okay, we reviewed their amended work plan. Time goes by, we end up sending them another letter. 3 years go by, we end up sending out 6 letters asking them to comply with the approved work plans and get going on their assessment. It was pretty obvious this individual didn't have any real intention of doing the assessment on this site. The property itself was not worth very much money as is, and he couldn't find anybody to buy it. He submitted plans to redevelop the site. It was going to be a 2-story office building with 4 parking spaces, and the city said, no, that's not going to work. You're not going to get an approval for that. They also had an old kiosk and office building adjacent to the building there on the south, which apparently had become a home for the homeless. And the city had said that this lot is a blight, and so the city came to us and said, what can we do to get this guy into compliance, or to get this guy to tear the building down? That's what the city really wanted. So we talked to them. We had meetings and many conversations with the owner. He claimed not to have the money. He claimed to be running into permitting problems. There were a lot of issues. Nothing was getting done. And then my caseworker came up with the suggestion that, well, why don't we put this in the EAR account? Well, one of the problems with the EAR account is like Orange County was not real interested in getting into the whole contracting and managing contractors on these cleanup cases. The amount of time that we would spend on that one case would take a whole person out for a significant amount of their time, and we couldn't work on other cases. So we talked to the regional board, and the Santa Ana Regional Board, we knew already had experience with several other EAR account cases that they managed and that they were moving forward. We talked to them, and we got them to agree to take over the case, but in exchange for taking over the case as an EAR account site, we had to do all the legwork. We had to write up the chronology. We wrote up a summary of facts. We wrote up the application. We almost wrote up the nomination letter to the state board for them. We basically did what we needed to do to make the regional board as comfortable as possible to go ahead and accept the case. The EAR account folks were very flexible. We had to explain to them that once it got nominated and once it was accepted into the EAR account, Orange County was going to step out. We weren't going to be lead agency anymore. It was going to be the regional board. That took a little bit of explaining. A couple of times we had to remind them that that's how it was going to happen. But lo and behold, after about a year, it was nominated for the fund in March. It was accepted a few months later, and at about the same time that we had issued a notice of violation to the RP, and in the meantime, the district attorney had also filed another court case against the owner for failure to meet to abide by the original directives of his original injunction. At this point, the DA came to us and said, "Okay, what do we need to put in this injunction to make sure that this guy complies with the work?" Well, we were already moving ahead with this EAR account case. So the one thing that the regional board warned us about was that access can become an issue. It can be a real problem. So we made sure that the district attorney, and he was the district attorney was great. He was taking all of our suggestions. He made sure that within the injunction that, and the RP was also put on probation for 3 years, that there is going to be unconditional access to the county, the regional board, the state water board, South Coast Air Quality Management District, and any other local or state government official and or their contractors to this site. The regional board has the keys to the padlocks on this site. Let me just give you a ground view. That's it. It's that green patch of grass there, and that's Beach Boulevard on the other side. There's not much room to work on here. The case was finally accepted into the EAR account. I believe in the first year, the regional board was basically working on selecting a contractor, getting a work plan put together, and then actually got a number of monitoring wells installed across Beach Boulevard to the southwest, and get a series of geoprobe borings done. In the last 2 years, we've gotten additional monitoring wells. We've got a work plan in now for on-site remediation wells, and a corrective action plan has been prepared, although it hasn't been approved. There's still some more details waiting on that. This was a case where basically the property owner wasn't going to do anything, and it became pretty obvious. He stalled out everybody on the tank removal. Now he was stalling us out on the cleanup. And by working with the EAR account, the regional board, and the city, we were able to get the guy to at least step away. He knows that there's going to be a lien on this property. At this point, he thinks this is kind of a loss on one of his investments that just went upside down. So he stepped back, and he's basically taken himself out of the picture. And now, the regional board, with our help, is able to finally get this case moving along. So. Now, that's about all I have. I wanted to keep it very brief. So I guess we'll take questions a little bit later if you have any. Yeah. And now we'll go to Linda.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. I'm going to talk about cases from the I-710 corridor. We worked on all of the stuck cases, which Steve mentioned a little bit about, but we really prioritized working on sites that were in redevelopment priority areas for the cities, and also sites that had not been assessed at all, or sites that needed additional assessment to determine the extent of contamination there. And I'll move on to some of the barriers that we ran into. There were many, many more barriers than this, but I didn't want to go through our 5 pages of barriers. So just in general, obtaining access and funding was really a challenge, and some other of the folks before me touched on the issue of communicating strategically with the property owners, and calling them in for meetings or calling them on the phone and just explaining the process to them. I think that was really key in getting access, because a lot of the owners were concerned and even doing a site assessment because they were afraid they're going to find contamination there, and then they're afraid that if they don't have any money, are they going to lose their property? All of these are mom and pops that we've been dealing with. So it really was a lot of back and forth to let them know the process moving forward. A lot of language barriers were encountered, making sure that someone was there to explain the process in their language and let them know that there are resources out there, and these are the steps, the technical steps that we need to go through in order to close their case. So we also ran across permitting issues. A lot of these sites had back taxes and liens, so that was another thing that we had to overcome. And really partnering with both the regulatory agencies and the cities was really key in overcoming some of those permitting issues. Property ownership, that was a question with some of these sites that were up for auction, or people that claimed they didn't even own the land. So we wanted to make sure that we had access from the right people before we went out and utilized some of these funds to do field work. Site security, we worked in a lot of high crime areas, so that was another issue, getting equipment stolen, and we've seen this on other sites that had remediation equipment there. That was another challenge. And then finally, the loss of redevelopment agencies, especially in accessing the targeted brownfields assessment program, which Deirdre mentioned. That particular funding source, you need to have a public agency or nonprofit apply. So it's really key to partner with a public agency or nonprofit, and typically those were the redevelopment agencies who applied for that funding. But since they were eliminated, it made it a little bit more of a challenge. And in one case, for the sites that we worked on in Long Beach, the regional board, Region 4, actually submitted the applications for those cases. So thanks to them, we were able to move those sites towards closure. So really the preliminary research that we went through before handing over the cases to Katya to do the responsible party searches would be looking at the assessor's website, so we need the owner information and the parcel numbers. And there's a lot of confusion sometimes. We ran into the caseworker sending out letters to the wrong addresses because they would only depend on the assessor's database for the address. I don't know, is there a show of hands for people who use the assessor website for the property owner address? Do any of you actually use other sources? DataQuick? Okay, like it's a city database?
No, it's a private.
It's a private, oh, okay. So yeah, in Region 4 in LA County, it was just typical that they would use the assessor's database, but sometimes we would find, doing online research, physical file reviews from other cities, we could actually find other addresses or phone numbers, and we wouldn't even need to go to industrial economics if we did find a good contact there. Doing a site visit, seeing if there's anybody there that we can talk to, or just seeing what's going on at the site mainly was the first step. And then we drafted a site summary sheet to summarize the technical and regulatory status of the site, just to put in one place, the site history, kind of like what Grant talked about. It's really helpful to have as a quick reference when you're meeting with the RP, when you're meeting with caseworkers, so everyone kind of can see, here are the max concentrations, if there was any data, and here's the regulatory history, and as well as here are all the named responsible parties. So this wasn't something that we would give to the RP or put in GeoTracker because it did have some sensitive information about who the RPs were. Here's just an example, putting a picture of the site, and this is actually a site where the parcel or the address was the wrong address for the specific parcel that we were referring to, and the assessor's ID number that for the parcel that we were concerned with actually had no address available in the assessor's database. So running into challenges like that was very difficult, and we had to compare past reports to really make sure we were dealing with the right site. And then one of the tools that we developed with EPA, and this is really Steve's kind of invention, was this joint letter between the EPA and the Water Board, and just gave the letter a little bit more weight. And Deirdre actually has examples to hand out, and I will post this on the CUPA website as well as Grant's letter too, so you guys can have a couple of examples. So in this letter, we just spelled out very clearly, here's what we know about the property. You are named as a responsible party. You have three options, basically. A, you can do the required work. B, you can dispute that you're the responsible party. Or C, you can claim financial inability, but you have to provide your financial information. You have to fill out a form, which is included as an attachment to that letter, and give us your tax returns, and and also sign a right of entry agreement. And then we would take that and turn that over to Katya again, and they would conduct the ability to pay analysis. Oh, sorry.
Did you put that U.S. EPA letter on GeoTracker for ease of access?
Oh, yeah, it is on GeoTracker.
Okay, great.
But because you're concerned with this, you want to find this letter?
For the individual sites.
For the individual sites, they are on GeoTracker, because they are directive letters, yeah.
That's what I was hoping to hear.
Yeah. Okay, so now getting into the specific sites. So this was the first site that we worked on, known as Kim's Arco, and it burnt down 20 years ago during the LA riots in 1992. And so for years and years, LA County, City of Compton had been sending notices to the wrong address, basically the address on file with the county assessor's office. People thought the owner was off the country, or they, no one knew where they were. EPA used LexisNexis to actually track down the owners, and we sent them the joint letter. They responded, or at least their daughter responded because they didn't speak English, submitted all the documents. We got approval to use the Federal Less Trust Fund to do field work on this site, and then we're moving forward to do the field work and to go out and do the geophysical survey, and there's a lock on the fence. And so we're like, okay, who has the lock? We contact the owner's daughter, and they don't know, and actually she doesn't think that they own the property because they went through bankruptcy in the 90s. So we're like, okay, well, who does own this property? So after numerous calls around and finally getting to the bottom of it, we did find out they were still the owners. Talking to the U.S. trustee and calling around to see try to find whatever city department put that lock on the fence. We finally determined they were still the owners, and we went ahead. Oh, go ahead.
I want to add one thing to it. So this was really interesting. They thought because they went through bankruptcy that they lost the property. The bankruptcy trustee could not sell the property. No one would buy it. So it was called what's abandoned in bankruptcy. So it reverts back to the original owner. They didn't understand they still owned that property. So it sat vacant for years with them not understanding they owned it.
Yeah.
And it ended up having businesses on the property that were squatters because there was nobody there.
Yeah, there were some vehicles. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Who was paying the taxes on it?
No one. It was like a couple $100,000 intact delinquent. For some reason, it did not go up for auction that we know of. What's that?
Luckily.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was one of the things that we really had to check, too, and making sure that when we were going to do the field work, was the site going to go up for auction before that? So we wanted to make...
If they hadn't been paying the taxes, it technically should have gone up to auction.
Correct.
First. I mean, did you have priority saying, well, we found this all out, let's stop, don't put it on auction, do you want to deal with them? Or?
No, we just talked to the county assessor, or actually the tax collector and treasurer's office, and asked them, what are is this property going up for auction in your next tax auction? And they said no. So that they were able to tell me the earliest that it would be, if it was selected, would be over a year ahead of time. So I don't know why. Maybe we'll find out tomorrow. We're meeting with the assessor, so we'll ask them. So yeah, here's a picture of some field work taking place, view from the Rosecrans Bridge in Compton. And we actually did do a little media event for this site. It was the 20th anniversary of the LA city riots, so there was some, media worthiness of doing an event at that time, and EPA was there, and it's not something that regulators typically would do, but it's something that the cities might be interested in doing if you've partnered with them, like the city of Compton. So they brought out city council members, and also a member of Congress was there. So it was, it really raised visibility for the project that we were doing. It's a multi-agency effort to really take care of these stuck sites. All right, this site, how much time do we have for wrap up?
Go faster than
okay.
Just a few minutes.
Okay, so Cafe Camellia, this is a site in Bellflower. Here's this window tint operation that is kind of a defunct business, and Cafe Camellia, which I've heard is a really good restaurant, but it doesn't look like that so much. But anyhow, this site, the redevelopment plan was stalled, and so we partnered with the city of Bellflower. There were some access issues related to the property being owned by a trust, but really partnering with the city, we were able to negotiate access, and this site we got into the targeted brownfields assessment program, so that's why the city of Bellflower actually applied. And then EPA's brownfields contractor went out and did the work, which involved removing these really old tanks. The site was abandoned in the 70s, actually. And the good news is no additional work is needed, so the site will receive a no further action letter. And here is a picture of the rendition of the new redevelopment project that will include retail stores and a new Cafe Camellia that will hopefully look as good on the outside as the food's supposed to taste on the inside, and also a courtyard for community events. All right, this is the last site. Again, this is the site that had the picture on the first slide that Steve talked about. The dead end sign wasn't standing up when I went by there. It was actually on this pile, but I just had to put it up to take the picture. So this site had been abandoned since 98, and again, we had property owners who claimed that they were not the property owners because they had stopped paying on their promissory note. but they were indeed still the property owners. But this site was actually going to be up for auction, so we did partner with the city of Compton, who was planning to purchase the property for a low-income housing project, and we wanted to make sure that we wouldn't do this work and then someone else would come along and purchase the property at the auction and benefit from the federal funding. Again, this site we used the Federal Less Trust Fund on. And this RP, since they claimed they were not the property owner, they wouldn't provide any financial information for us, but they did after LA County and I hounded them, and also someone from EPA as well, put pressure on this guy to finally sign the access agreement so we wouldn't have to go through obtaining a warrant, which we were prepared to do, but this was much faster. So we ended up going forward with that site assessment, which also involved tank removal, and this is just a City of Compton representative with a neighbor that came by, and this site was in a really high crime area, and all the neighbors said that there was a lot of gang violence there previously, but now it's supposedly better. But it's also neighboring another low-income housing apartment building. And actually all of these sites that I talked about were nearby residential. So I think that's all that I have.
All right.
Any questions? Or actually, do you want to do your...
I'll just do my really quick closing thoughts, and then we can just do questions and discussion.
Okay.
If you have stuck sites, you as a regulator, unfortunately it's all of us as regulators. It's our responsibility to move these forward and get these done, to basically have the plan to get them through the system and to the end, the path to closure. And it can be challenging. You've heard about some of these sites. We learned firsthand from some of these sites in I-710 how challenging it can be. And as we went along, we came up with strategies to make it as efficient as possible, and we're continuing to work on efficiency because that is really key. There are tools and resources available, as we talked about, things like the EAR account, like what Anthony did, partnering with the regional board to access the EAR account more efficiently. It's a great example. There is the Federal Less Trust Fund money that we give California every year, and some of it actually goes into these contracts to help do this type of work. So if you've got sites that may need that type of resource, come talk to us. But tools are available out there. We probably need better tools, but right now we do have tools. Some of these accounts, like the EAR account, it's underutilized. So we need to utilize it as much as we can, because I think the work is there. We're just not putting the pieces together and lining things up as well as we could yet. But we got to get there. And using these tools may require you to gain new expertise. I mean, I'm an engineer by training, but I've come to learn about tax auctions and foreclosures and all kinds of real estate stuff. So you almost have to think of yourself as a paralegal, a real estate professional, a negotiator. You gotta be multifaceted and be able to do this work well. So gain expertise and broaden your professional network and get creative. Sometimes it takes creativity to do this right. And again, due to the large universe of small sites, we're kind of at a disadvantage. So we've got to really maximize our efficiency, and we can't rely on the lawyers. The answer to fixing these sites is, just handing the file to the lawyer. We can't do that. We got to do like what Grant was talking about. Tee it up. If you need legal help, you need to tee it up and make it really easy for them. Got to act like a paralegal, so it's very little of their work. Kind of use them as the gorilla in the closet, but we as the regulators are the first line, and we need to basically do most of the heavy lifting. And again, if you need help developing your strategies, we'd be happy to work with people to help them. We've got some of these resources available. You can talk to myself or Deirdre, or call Kevin. He'll probably tell you to call me. Here's our contact information. So with that, time for questions.
Okay, I have a lot, but one of them, if a bank owns a property, and it's not underground storage tank, but uses that was there before left a bunch of waste.
Okay.
Is the bank now responsible?
Depends on what the bank's done with the property. There are, both under state and federal rules, there are lender liability provisions that basically limit lender liability, but they actually have to act in certain ways. They cannot be essentially actively operating the property or renting it out or doing things using the property. So we've seen people on some of the sites that we've been working on. We've had 2 different claims of lender liability that were essentially bogus claims of lender liability. But we kind of need to think strategically. We kind of said, okay, tell us why you're not an RP, but then you can go back to them and say, well, we may end up doing this work, and then we may end up, if we determine later that you're not qualified for this lender liability, we may end up suing you. So when you start having those types of discussions with people, they kind of maybe will retract, because they usually know, and they try to throw up these barriers and roadblocks, and it is really kind of a negotiation game sometimes, especially with some of these, we've had some fairly squishy lenders.
If I might just add to, if it's hazardous waste, if it's drums, it's abandoned, you might reach out to DTSC too, because they have both enforcement options, but they also have a program for waste for which there's no real responsible party.
And then just real quick, one of the sites you were talking about, I think it was the one in Orange County that said that there's a lien on the property. So is that process of putting a lien on a property, is that pretty straightforward? Like, can you do that, or just your
No. The lien on the property is actually put on by the state, by the ear account folks. That's their cost of coverage. So they take care of all that. They're still providing the money. They've got the money, in the bank, and they're able to provide it. And someday somebody's going to figure out how to make some money off that little plot of land, and when they do,
One thing that we learned from the ear account, we heard this last year at the Coupa conference from the regional board up in Sacramento, that when you start nominating cases for the ear account, and they actually have to kind of go through a public nomination process, suddenly the landowners kind of change their mind and decide they want to work on the sites. So we did that this last year with LA, and we nominated, 7 sites? Or
7 sites, 6 new sites.
6 new sites. We nominated 6 new sites, and how many?
4 of the RPs.
4 of the RPs ended up just doing the work. So just that whole process of, starting to put them on that list gets them to kind of change their mind. So it's a good tool from that aspect.
Actually, even sending out a letter threatening to put them on the list has also proven effective. So you don't even have to go through the process of actually putting them on the list. You can sometimes just let them know that they will be nominated if they don't do something, and then we've also seen some RPs, submit work plans right away.
Any other questions?
How many cases are left?
We're still counting. I mean, it's when we did that original non-cuff study, which we looked at 1,000 sites, there was I believe a couple hundred that we kind of characterized as stuck, and that was just a fraction of the cases in the state. We're finding these abandoned tank sites that aren't yet in GeoTracker. I think most of those we would consider stuck. So there's a lot, and there's different degrees of being stuck. But I think what we're typically seeing is the main reason for these sites not moving typically is not technical reasons, that it's too difficult. It's usually the RP doesn't have money, doesn't want to do work, and then the lack of enforcement resources. And it really, I think it comes down to strategy as a regulator. How do you get people moving again? And some of these other funding tools, and saying, well, we'll put it on the ear list because you're recalcitrant, may get things moving, or we'll talk to the EPA and the state board and try to use less trust fund money, and then maybe we'll cost recover against you. I mean, those types of things. Additional pressure definitely helps. It's a challenge, though. We've got a lot of cases, and this is a lot of work. It's a lot more work to, as a regulator, to be basically proactive and push sites forward that are stuck than wait for the willing RPs to come in and say, I want to get my site cleaned up. And I think the one thing we have seen is, areas where the property values are high, it's much more likely to see willing RPs come in and they want to get sites cleaned up and basically cut property deals. That's why I think we're seeing so many of these sites in like the 710 corridor, because the property values are relatively low there. I think also we've got a lot of basically stuck cases in rural areas where there isn't really pressure to redevelop the properties. So there's a lot of cases out there that need kind of a lot of kind of regulator pushing to make them work. And that's our jobs as regulators. We're supposed to regulate. Any other questions? Are we done early? So if you have cases that you need help with, let us know, because we've like the work that Katya is doing. I mean, we've got capacity to do others. If you need help researching RPs or ability to pay, let us know. We can do that for you. So we're a resource. We're from the federal government. We're here to help.